On the morning of February 4th, 1944, two American bombers crossed the sky above Truk Lagoon at 30,000 feet. The Japanese saw them. That is the part almost nobody tells you. The lookouts caught the glint of sunlight on aluminum wings. The anti-aircraft crews watched two black specks drift slowly east, far above the reach of any gun on the island. There was nothing anyone could do. The cameras were already running. 13 days later, the sky over Truk went black with American aircraft. The men crouched in the coral bunkers below tried to count them. They reached 400 and stopped. Afterward, some of them swore there had been 900. Nobody ever corrected them. But here is what those men did not know as they watched the ocean burn. The great battle fleet they believed they were defending had already slipped out through the reef passage a week before. The heaviest blow the United States Navy had ever thrown was about to land on an empty trap. And here is what the Americans did not know. Truk would not be invaded. It would not be liberated. It would not even be visited again. 24,000 men would be left behind on those islands with the burning water and the sunken ships. And the world would forget them there for 18 months. The planes were never the thing that killed Truk. There is a photograph of Truk Lagoon taken from the air, and if you did not know what you were looking at, you would think it was a postcard. A ring of green islands set in water so clear that the coral heads show through it like bruises under skin. Volcanic peaks rising out of the middle. Wrapped in cloud, a barrier reef running around the whole thing for 140 miles. Breaking the Pacific swell into white lace before it can ever reach the anchorage inside. 40 miles across, deep enough for battleships. Sheltered enough that a man could sleep on the open deck of a destroyer and never feel the ship move beneath him. The Japanese had held it since the end of the First World War. The Americans had never seen it. Not once. Not from the sea. Not from the air. Not through the periscope of a submarine. For 25 years, Truk was a rumor, and rumors grow. By the winter of 1943, American newspapers had given the place a name. They called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. They wrote about coastal batteries buried in the volcanic rock. They wrote about submarine pens and underground fuel bunkers and a garrison waiting behind the reef for anyone foolish enough to come. Officers at Pearl Harbor read those stories in the mess and said nothing, because they had nothing better. Nobody knew. That was the whole trouble. Nobody in the United States Navy could tell you what was inside Truk Lagoon. And so every man filled the blank space with the worst thing he could imagine. The Japanese read the same stories. That is the thing that gets lost. The men who defended Truk believed the legend too. They had been told in briefings and in newspapers and in the confident voices of their own admirals that they were standing on the strongest naval position in the Pacific Ocean. Some of them had been there for 3 years. They had never fired a shot in anger. The war was something that happened to other men. In the Solomons, at Guadalcanal, in the black water off Savo Island, it came back to Truk in the form of wounded ships and wounded crews, and it went out again. The lagoon itself stayed quiet. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi commanded the 4th Fleet, and the 4th Fleet was responsible for Truk. He was 54 years old. He had spent his life in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and by 1944 he had arrived at the kind of command that looks impressive on paper and feels hollow in the hand. The 4th Fleet was not a fighting fleet. It was an administrative one. It ran the bases, the supply dumps, the seaplane tenders, the harbor tugs, the men who painted hulls and mended nets. The battleships that anchored in his lagoon did not answer to him. They answered to Tokyo and to the man whose flag flew above them. That man was Admiral Minaichi Koga. Koga was 58, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, and he had inherited the job the way a man inherits a debt. His predecessor, Isoroku Yamamoto, had been ambushed and killed in the air over Bougainville in April of 1943. The Americans had read the Japanese codes and known exactly where he would be Koga took the flag over a navy that was still winning battles and already losing the war. And he understood the arithmetic better than almost anyone in Japan. He had seen the intelligence estimates. He knew what was coming out of the American shipyards. The Essex-class carriers, not one, not two, a production line of them. Japan had built 10 aircraft carriers in 20 years. The United States had laid down more than that in a single year, and the first of them were already in the Pacific, and behind them there were more, and behind those there were more still. Koga did not need a battle to understand what that meant. He needed only a calendar. On the morning of the 4th of February, 1944, 2 American aircraft appeared over Truk Lagoon. They came in high at 30,000 feet, and they came from the direction of the Marshall Islands, where American Marines had just taken Kwajalein in 4 days. The Japanese lookouts saw them. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to imagine the defenders caught asleep. They were not asleep. Men on the reef line watched sunlight move along 2 sets of aluminum wings and understood immediately what they were seeing. The anti-aircraft guns on Dublin Island could not reach 30,000 feet. Nothing on those islands could reach 30,000 feet. The fighters that scrambled, climbed, and clawed and fell away short. The 2 aircraft turned east and went home. It took them a long time. They had come a very long way to take photographs down in the lagoon. 60-odd ships sat at anchor in perfect focus. The film went back to Kwajalein, and from Kwajalein it went to Pearl Harbor, and men who had spent 25 years imagining Truk finally saw it. There were no coastal batteries buried in the volcanic rock. There was no dry dock that could take a battleship. There were airfields, and there were fuel tanks. And there was a merchant fleet lying at anchor in the most beautiful harbor in the world with nowhere to hide. The Gibraltar of the Pacific was a lagoon with ships in it. But that was not the part that changed everything. The photographs also showed what was there on the 4th of February. Battleships, heavy cruisers, carriers, the hardcore of the combined fleet, riding at anchor, waiting. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz looked at that and saw the opportunity of the war, find the Japanese fleet, fix it in place, destroy it. Every American naval officer since the age of sail had been raised on the idea of the decisive battle, and here it was, photographed, catalogue, sitting still in 40 miles of enclosed water. The strike was given a name, Hailstone. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance would command it. He was 57, and he had already won Midway, and almost nobody outside the Navy knew his name. He did not give interviews. He did not raise his voice. He walked 10 miles a day and thought in silence, and the men who worked for him found that harder to bear than shouting. Una him, Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher would take the carriers in. Mitcher was 57 as well. A small, sunburned man with a voice worn down to a rasp, who wore a long-billed cap against the glare and turned his chair backward on the flag bridge so that he could watch his aircraft come home. He counted them every time. He counted them out and he counted them back. And everyone who served with him knew he was doing it. They would bring 9 aircraft carriers, 5 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, 4 light carriers, Bellewood, Cabot, Monterey, Cowpens, more than 500 aircraft, battleships behind them, cruisers, destroyers, submarines already moving into position outside the reef passages to catch anything that ran. It was the largest concentration of naval air power ever assembled by any nation to that date, and it was being sent to a place no American had ever seen from the surface of the sea. They set course for Truk, and somewhere in that same stretch of ocean, going the other way, Admiral Koga was already gone. He had made the decision within days of seeing what the Americans could do to Kwajalein. He did not consult the newspapers about the Gibraltar of the Pacific. He looked at his own lagoon, and he saw a harbor with 2 entrances and no roof. And he understood that a fleet caught at anchor is not a fleet, it is a target list. On the 10th of February, the battleship Musashi weighed anchor and went out through the reef passage. She was one of the 2 largest warships that had ever been built. 70,000 tons of steel. Guns that threw a shell, the weight of an automobile, over 20 miles. A light cruiser, Oite, went with her. 4 destroyers screened them. Admiral Koga was aboard. She was the last Japanese battleship ever to leave Truk Lagoon. Behind her went the rest of it, in 1s and 2s, quietly over the following days. The heavy cruisers, the carriers, the fleet oilers that mattered. Kobayashi stood on Dublin Island and watched the combined fleet withdraw from the anchorage he had been ordered to defend. And there was nothing in his orders that told him what to do about it. The ships that could not fight stayed. The transports, the armed merchantmen, the submarine tenders, the repair ship Akashi, full of spare parts the Navy could not replace. The oiler Shinkoku Maru, which had refueled the carriers that struck Pearl Harbor. The Kokumaru, packed with ammunition and with nearly 1,000 men who had nowhere to go. 30-odd ships, 200,000 tons of hulls with no guns, worth the name. Musashi did not go to Palau. That is the detail that historians repeat and storytellers forget. She turned north and ran for Japan, for the Naval yard at Yokosuka, and she tied up there on the 15th of February. So on the morning that Truk began to burn, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet was not on a bridge, and he was not at a forward base, and he was not anywhere within 2,000 miles of the men he had left behind. Admiral Mineshi Koga was in the home islands of Japan, ashore, reading signals. He had done the correct thing. He had saved the fleet. Not one Japanese battleship, not one carrier, not one heavy cruiser was lost at Truk. And the reason is that Koga read the photographs of the 4th of February exactly as the Americans read them. And he moved first. He would never be forgiven for it. And 90 miles to the northeast, in the dark before dawn, on the 17th of February, 9 American carriers turned into the wind, and 500 engines started at once. And Mark Mitcher began to count. The first thing was the sound, not engines, not sirens, on the islands ringing Truk Lagoon. In the last dark of the 17th of February, the men who were awake heard nothing at all except the reef, which never stopped, and the wind moving through palm fronds, which never stopped either. A cook was lighting fires. A signalman was walking back from the latrine. Somewhere on the anchorage, a bosun was ringing a bell to mark the hour. And the sound went out across 4,000 square miles of black water and came back off the volcanic slopes of Dublin Island a half-second later. The Japanese called this hour the hour of the tiger. It is the hour when a man's blood runs slowest and his guard is lowest. And in 25 years of watching the sky, nothing had ever come out of it. 90 miles to the northeast. 9 aircraft carriers had turned into the wind an hour before. They came in with the sunrise behind them, which is the oldest trick in aerial warfare and the hardest one to counter, because a man looking east at dawn sees nothing but light. About 70 Grumman Hellcats. They crossed the barrier reef at low altitude with the water going gold underneath them, and then they climbed hard, engines opening up all at once. And for the first time in 25 years, the anchorage heard what was coming for it. On the airfields of Eton and Param and Moen, Japanese pilots ran. It was not cowardice, it was arithmetic. There were perhaps 360 aircraft on those islands, and most of them were parked wingtip to wingtip in the open because nobody had ever needed to disperse them. Zeros began rolling. Some got airborne. Roughly 30 Japanese fighters were shot out of the sky in the first minute, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and the ones behind them took off into a sky that already belonged to somebody else. There is a phrase that pilots used for what happened over Truk that morning. They said the sky was full, not full of enemies, just full. Wherever a Japanese pilot turned, there was a Hellcat there already. Higher, faster, better armored, flown by a man with 400 hours of training behind him instead of 120. In 40 minutes, it was over. By the time the fighter sweep turned for home, Japanese air power at Truk had ceased to exist as an organized thing. The pilots who survived were scattered across 3 islands with no radio net, no fuel trucks that had not been strafed, and no runways that were not cratered. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi stood on the high ground above the anchorage and watched the last of his fighters cartwheel into the shallows. He had been in the Imperial Japanese Navy for more than 30 years. He had never seen an air battle end so fast. He had never seen one end at all. In fact, because in his experience, air battles did not end. They wore each other down and both sides went home and came back the next day. Nobody was going home. The next wave was already inbound. They came at the ships. The dive bombers came first out of 10,000 feet, and the men in the lagoon could hear them before they could see them. A rising shriek that seemed to come from every direction because it was coming from every direction. Behind them, the Avengers, low and heavy, torpedoes slung under their bellies, moving at 180 knots straight down the throat of whatever anti-aircraft fire the merchant fleet could raise. It was not much. It was never going to be much. These were cargo ships and oilers and repair vessels, and the guns bolted to their decks were old, guns worked by men who loaded stores for a living. The tracers went up in slow orange chains, and the American aircraft flew through them. Understand what was in that lagoon on the morning of the 17th of February. Not warships. There were a handful of those, and they would die soon enough. What was in Truk Lagoon was Japan's supply line to the entire Central Pacific, the oiler Shinkoku Maru, which had steamed with the strike force to Pearl Harbor and refueled the carriers that launched the attack, and which now lay at anchor with her tanks full. The Fujikawa Maru, carrying disassembled Zero fighters in her holds, the Heian Maru, the Kiyosumi Maru, the San Francisco Maru with a deckload of tanks and mines and a hold full of aircraft bombs, the repair ship Akashi, the only vessel in the region capable of putting a damaged destroyer back to sea, packed with spare parts and machine tools that Japan could not build fast enough to replace, and the Ikoku Maru. She had been a fast passenger liner once, completed barely 3 years before, 10,000 tons, converted into an armed transport with guns on her decks and a cargo of ammunition in her holds. On the morning of the 17th, she had nearly 1,000 men aboard, soldiers, mostly some had been at Truk for months, some had arrived within the week. They were on deck when the Avengers came in low across the water from the north. Lieutenant James Bridges flew, one of them. He belonged to Torpedo Squadron 6, off the carrier, intrepid, and he had 2 men in the aircraft behind him, a radio man and a gunner. And he brought his Avenger in so low that the propeller wash tore a wake across the surface of the lagoon. He released. The torpedo ran true. What happened next is difficult to describe accurately because the men who were closest to it did not survive to describe it. The torpedo found the ammunition. A 10,000-ton ship does not sink in that circumstance. It stops existing. The blast went up in a single column, black and orange, and shot through with the shapes of things that had been solid a half second earlier, and it climbed and kept climbing. And the shock wave crossed the water in a visible ring and slapped the hulls of ships a mile away. Lieutenant Bridges was still in the fireball. He had not had time, to clear the Ikoku Maru took nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers to the bottom of the lagoon, and she took the American who killed her and his radio man and his gunner. They are all still down there. They have been in the same water for more than 80 years. Nobody planned that. Nobody could have, and there is no lesson in it, which is what makes it worth telling. Bridges did not die for a cause, and the men on the Ikoku Maru did not die for one either. A man in an aircraft pulled a release lever at the correct moment, and the arithmetic of high explosive did the rest, and the sea closed over all of them together. Men on ships a mile away were knocked off their feet by the pressure of it. Windows broke on Dublin Island. An explosion of that size is not something a man hears. It arrives in the chest and the teeth and the bones behind the eyes. And what comes down afterward is not smoke and it is not rain. And the crews on the surrounding decks stood in it without moving. For most of a minute, nobody in that part of the lagoon fired a gun or shouted an order. Then steel began falling out of the sky. Pieces of a ship that no longer existed, driving into the water all across the anchorage, and the war started again. The lagoon burned all day. There is a particular quality to burning fuel oil on seawater that men who saw it never lost. It does not burn like a fire ashore. It lies flat and it spreads, and the flame stands up off the surface in a low sheet that moves with the current, and the smoke it makes is not gray. It is black, the way tar is black, and it hangs low, and it gets into cloth and skin and hair, and men who swam out of it came up the ladders of rescue boats with their faces printed permanently darker than the rest of them. The water in Truk Lagoon had been clear enough that morning to read the shape of coral heads through 40 feet of it. By noon, a man could not see his own hand below the surface. Oil came out of the Shinkoku Maru and spread across the water and caught. Ships that tried to raise anchor were bracketed and hit and sank where they turned. Some captains ran their vessels toward the reef and grounded them deliberately, hoping to save the crews, and the aircraft came back and worked them over in the shallow. The Fujikawa Maru went down with her, Zero still crated. The San Francisco Maru went down with their tanks lashed to the deck, and they are lashed there still, 3 tanks in a row in 180 feet of water. Their gun barrels pointed at nothing. 30 separate strikes went in over 2 days. Roughly 1,250 individual aircraft sorties, 400 tons of bombs and torpedoes into an area a man could walk across in an afternoon. The American pilots came back to their carriers all through that day, and they were not celebrating. This is in the accounts, and it is the strangest thing about Operation Hailstone. The greatest carrier strike the world had ever seen was going in against a merchant fleet. There were no Japanese carriers. There were no battleships. There was nothing to fight. Men who had trained for 2 years to attack the Imperial Japanese Navy were sinking coastal freighters and water barges and harbor tugs. And they knew, from the moment the first strike photographs came back, that the fleet they had come 3,000 miles to destroy had left the anchorage a week before they arrived. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher counted his aircraft back onto the decks. He always did. He turned his chair around on the flag bridge and watched them come and counted, and that afternoon most of them came home. And it did not feel like a victory to him either. But Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance was not finished. He was 57 years old, and he had a reputation in the Navy as the most cautious flag officer in the Pacific. A man who had turned away from a night engagement at Midway rather than risk what he could not see. His critics said it in the wardrooms: Spruance will not close. Spruance will not gamble. On the afternoon of the 17th of February, Raymond Spruance took 2 battleships inside the range of every gun on Truk and went hunting. He formed a task group and put his own flag in it. The battleships, New Jersey and Iowa, the newest and fastest capital ships in the United States Navy, the heavy cruisers, Minneapolis and New Orleans, 4 destroyers, and he steamed them clockwise around the outside of the barrier reef, slowly, at the speed of a walking man, looking for anything that came out of the passages. It was an extraordinary thing to do. Truk was believed to be armed. Truk was believed to have submarines. He did it anyway. In daylight, with his own flag flying, a light cruiser Katori came out of the reef passage into that. She was an old training ship built to teach cadets 7,000 tons. And she had already been hit by aircraft that morning and was down by the head and making smoke. She came out through the channel and found herself in open water with 2 American battleships 8 miles away and a full broadside bearing on her. There is nothing to say about what followed. The 16-inch guns of the Iowa opened at close range, and the 16-inch guns of the New Jersey followed, and the cruisers joined, and the destroyers joined, and the Katori was hit and hit and hit until she rolled over and went down by the stern with her screws still turning in the air. Spruance watched it from the bridge of the New Jersey. The destroyer Maikaze came out next. Her captain saw the American line and did what a Japanese destroyer captain was trained to do. He turned toward it. He worked up to full speed into the fire of 2 battleships and 2 heavy cruisers, and he launched torpedoes. They did not reach. Maikaze was hit by shells the size of a man and broke apart and sank with every soul aboard. 1 ship got away. The destroyer Milwaukee turned and ran, and the Iowa fired on her at more than 20 miles. Some of the longest range gunfire an American battleship ever attempted, and the shells straddled her and threw water across her decks and did not hit. She kept running. She lived. Night came down on Truk Lagoon on the 17th of February, and the fires on the water burned brighter as the light went out of the sky. And this is where the story turns, because that night the Japanese struck back, and they did it with 1 aircraft somewhere on one of the wrecked airfields, Nakaima Torpedo Bomber. The type the Americans had nicknamed the Kate was fueled and armed and pushed by hand onto a strip of runway that had been filled in with coral that afternoon. The crew took off in darkness. They flew out over a lagoon that was still burning, past the hulls of ships they had known by name, and they went looking for the American fleet by the light of the moon. They found the Intrepid. She was 36,000 tons of new construction, a fleet carrier with 3,000 men aboard, and she never saw the aircraft that killed her deck. The torpedo went into her starboard quarter and blew a hole below the waterline and jammed her rudder hard over. 11 Americans died in the compartments back there. The ship went into a slow turn. She could not stop and could not correct, and her captain steadied her by working the engines against each other and by rigging a sail out of scrap canvas on the forecastle to hold her head into the wind. The Intrepid limped away from Truk that night, and she did not return to the war until August. 6 months out of the greatest naval offensive in history, taken off the board by 1 aircraft flown by men whose names nobody recorded. The empty trap still had teeth, and on that same night, on the deck of the carrier Enterprise, 12 Avengers were being armed with 4 500-pound bombs apiece. Lieutenant Commander William Martin commanded Torpedo Squadron 10. He was 33 years old, and for 6 months he had been telling anyone who would listen that a carrier aircraft could find a ship in total darkness using the radar set bolted into its wing, and that nobody had ever tried it because everybody assumed it could not be done. Naval aviators did not fly at night. They barely landed at night. The accident rate was appalling, and the whole culture of the carrier force was built around getting your aircraft home before the light went. He had trained his squadron to do it anyway. Every night for 6 months. They launched into the dark a little after 2 in the morning on the 18th of February. No formation. No visual contact between aircraft. Each crew alone in a black sky over a black ocean, watching a small green screen where the ships of Truk Lagoon showed as smears of light. They came in at 300 feet, below masthead height, so low that the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, hearing engines, and seeing nothing, fired upward into empty air while the Avengers went past underneath them. In a little more than an hour, 12 aircraft sank roughly 60,000 tons of shipping. Read that again, because it matters. 12 aircraft at night, alone, with no fighter escort and no lights. Destroyed about 1/3 of all the tonnage that Task Force 58 sank at Truk across 2 days and 1,250 sorties. Every one of them came back. Nothing in naval aviation was ever quite the same after that hour. Night carrier operations, which had been considered an eccentric's hobby, became doctrine. Within a year, the United States Navy would have entire carriers dedicated to it. William Martin flew home in the dark, landed on a moving deck he could not see until he was on it, and went to breakfast. Morning, the 18th of February, the smoke over Truk Lagoon had stopped rising in columns and had settled into a single flat layer that covered the anchorage and the islands and reached out over the reef on Oite. The water was black with oil and full of things that floated, and into that, through the northern passage, came the destroyer, Oite. Here is what had happened to her. 3 days earlier, on the 15th of February, the light cruiser Agano had left Truk for Japan. She had been torpedoed at Rabaul months before, and she was running on 2 of her 4 shafts, wounded and slow. And the Oite went with her as escort. On the afternoon of the 16th, 160 miles north of the atoll, the American submarine Skate found her and put 2 torpedoes into her starboard side. The Agano burned all night and went down in the morning. The Oite pulled 523 of her men out of the water. Think about that ship. A destroyer built in the 1920s, small, crowded, designed for a crew of 150, 523 survivors on her decks, in her passageways, in her mess spaces, oil in their eyes and their lungs, most of them with nothing on. The Oite's captain turned around. There was only one place within reach that had doctors and fresh water and a hospital, and that place was Truk. He ran for it all through the night of the 17th. And he ran toward the glow on the horizon, and he must have known by then what that glow was. He came through the passage at first light on the 18th of February with more than 670 men aboard, and the American aircraft found him within minutes. A torpedo hit the Oite amidships. She broke in half. The 2 halves went down separately in less than 3 minutes, in water so deep that both pieces are still there. Standing apart on the sand, 172 of her crew died. All 523 of the men she had rescued from the Agano died. 20 men came out of the water alive. They had survived a submarine. They had survived a night in a burning cruiser and a night on the deck of a destroyer running toward the only safe harbor in the Central Pacific. And the harbor was on fire, and it killed them. By the middle of that afternoon, it was finished. Task Force 58 turned east and left. There was no bombardment of the island, no landing craft, no Marines coming through the surf. The carriers recovered their last aircraft, and the destroyers took station, and the whole thing simply withdrew over the horizon in the direction it had come from. Kobayashi walked down to the shore of Dublin Island. Behind him, on the ridge, the anti-aircraft crews were still standing at their guns, pointed at an empty sky. 200,000 tons of shipping was gone. More than 250 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground. The light cruisers, Katori and Naka, the destroyers Maikaze and Fumizuki and Tachikaze and Oite, every fuel reserve on the atoll, the repair ship, the spare parts, the machine tools, the oiler that had fueled Pearl Harbor. The Americans had lost 25 aircraft, 40 men, 29 of them air crew, and 11 sailors in the stern of the Intrepid. 2 days later, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo relieved Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi of his command. It took them 2 days to decide whose fault it was. He had not ordered the fleet away. He had not chosen where to base it. He had not written the newspaper stories about the Gibraltar of the Pacific. He had simply been the man standing on the ridge when the sky came apart, and somebody had to be blamed, and Admiral Koga was in Japan. On the 19th of February, while the fires in the lagoon were still burning themselves out and the bodies were still coming ashore on the tide, a new commander arrived to take over the 4th Fleet. His name was Chuichi Hara. He was 54 years old, Vice Admiral, and he had spent his career on the bridges of aircraft carriers. He was given the 4th Fleet, and the 4th Fleet no longer had a single warship in it. Consider what it means to be given a fleet that does not exist. Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara came ashore at Truk on the 19th of February, 1944. 2 days after the last American aircraft turned east, he had commanded carriers. He had put pilots into the air at the Coral Sea and in the waters off Guadalcanal. He was a fighting officer, and Tokyo gave him command of the 4th Fleet, and the 4th Fleet was now a set of islands, a burned anchorage, some anti-aircraft guns, and roughly 24,000 men. Not one warship, not one aircraft that could reach an enemy. He was a naval officer in charge of a piece of land. The first thing they did was bury people. The tide brought bodies onto the beaches of Dublin and Oite for days, and the fires in the wrecks burned for longer than that. And the oil on the surface of the lagoon did not disperse for weeks. Working parties went out in small boats to pull men from the water who had been in it since the 17th. Some of the wrecks were burning below the waterline where the coal bunkers had caught, and they smoked quietly for a month. Then Hara set his men to digging. They dug because there was nothing else to do. They built revetments for aircraft that would never arrive. They cut new gun pits into the coral. They repaired the runways on Oite and Perim, filled the craters, rolled the surfaces flat, and they did it knowing that no fighter squadron was coming to use them. The Americans came back in April and destroyed what had been repaired. They came back again after that, not with 9 carriers. There was no need. A raid every few weeks was sufficient, and the raids were flown partly to keep the airfields dead and partly because Truk had become a convenient place for Green squadrons to practice. By the end of the war, air crews on their first combat tour were being sent to bomb Truk, the way a boxer works, a heavy bag. In June of 1945, a British carrier force struck the atoll almost entirely as a training exercise for its new pilots. That is what became of the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It became a place where beginners went to learn, and Admiral Koga, the man who had seen it coming and moved his fleet out in time, had 6 weeks left to live. He had reached Palau at the end of February. On the last day of March, with American carriers closing on the Palais and another anchorage about to become a killing ground, Koga ordered the fleet out again and took to the air himself. He flew in a Kawanishi flying boat, a great 4-engine thing the Allies called an Emily, bound for Davao in the Philippines. A second aircraft carried his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, and the operational plans for the defense of the entire empire. They flew into a typhoon. Koga's aircraft went down in the ocean and was never found. No wreckage, no bodies. The commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the man who had commanded the combined fleet through the worst year in its history, simply stopped existing somewhere in the dark over the Philippine Sea on the 31st of March, 1944. Fukudome's aircraft came down off the coast of Cebu. He survived. He swam ashore and was taken prisoner by Filipino guerrillas, and the waterproof case he had carried, containing Japan's plan for the decisive battle of the Pacific War, washed up on a beach and passed from hand to hand until it reached an American submarine. The Americans read Japan's war plan. They read it 3 months before the battle. It described, Tokyo told nobody that Koga was dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy concealed the loss of its commander-in-chief for 5 weeks, until May, when it quietly announced that Admiral Seimu Toyoda had taken the flag. There was no state funeral. There was no body. Kobayashi, the man they had relieved for losing Truk, was pushed out of active service on the 30th of May. Koga was gone. Kobayashi was gone. And Hara was still on the island. In June of 1944, the United States Navy came back through the Central Pacific with a force that made Hailstone look small. 15 carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft. They were going to the Mariana Islands, to Saipan and Tinian and Guam, because from the Marianas a B-29 bomber could reach Tokyo. The route ran past Truk. They did not stop. There was no landing, no Ziga, no surrender ceremony. The greatest fleet ever assembled, steamed by an atoll that had once been the most feared name in the Pacific Ocean. And it kept going, and the men on the islands watched the horizon and understood something that no one had prepared them for. Nobody was coming. Not the Americans, not the Japanese, nobody. The American term for it was to let a place wither on the vine. It was not cruelty. It was efficiency. Truk had been disarmed, and an island without aircraft or ships cannot threaten a supply line. And men die on beaches, taking places that do not need to be taken. So Truk was left alone, and the war moved north, and the 24,000 men on those islands were forgotten by both sides at once. They began to farm. Lieutenant General Shunzaburo Mugikura commanded the army troops. Hara commanded the Navy men. Between them, they divided the islands into plots and turned soldiers into farmers. Because the last supply convoy that mattered had been sunk in the lagoon in February, and after the Americans took Palau in September, there was almost nothing at all. A few submarines came through with medicine. Almost nothing came through with food. They planted sweet potatoes. They planted taro and cassava in ground that had been parade squares. They fished at night in small boats, close in, because anything on the water in daylight would be strafed. They caught rats. They ate lizards and snails and the soft inner parts of coconut palms. And when the palms were gone, they ate leaves. Beriberi came first. Then dysentery, then malaria, which had always been there and now had nothing to stop it. Men who had been trained to hold the strongest naval position in the Pacific spent 1945 carrying water in, cut down fuel drums, and arguing over the allocation of seed potatoes. The bombers still came every few weeks. Without warning, someone would drop a load of high explosive on an airstrip that had not seen an aircraft in a year. Men were killed weeding vegetable gardens. By May of 1945, the count on the atoll was 13,600 Army personnel under Mugikura and 10,600 Navy personnel under Hara. Nobody has ever established with certainty how many of them died of hunger and disease. It was not a battle, so there was no report. The men who kept the records were themselves starving. 18 months, from the 18th of February, 1944, when Task Force 58 turned east and went over the horizon, to the 2nd of September, 1945. On that morning, the war had been over for 2 weeks, and the surrender had been signed in Tokyo Bay, and the heavy cruiser Portland came into Truk Lagoon and anchored among the wrecks. The Japanese delegation came out to her in a small boat. They came up the accommodation ladder onto a spotless quarterdeck lined with American sailors, past the wreckage of their own ships, some of it still visible above the surface. Lieutenant General Shunsaburo Mugikura, Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara. Hara was 56 years old. He had been the commander of the 4th Fleet for 18 months and 14 days. And in all that time, he had never once put to sea. He sat down at a table on the deck of an American warship and he signed the surrender of Truk. Vice Admiral George Murray accepted it on behalf of the Pacific Fleet. Nobody had fought over the islands. The Americans had never landed, and yet on that morning there were more Japanese dead in the ground and in the water at Truk than had been lost on many an island that was stormed. The wrecks are still there. Truk is called Chuk now, and it belongs to the Federated States of Micronesia, and it is one of the great wreck diving destinations on Earth. Divers come from every continent to descend into the lagoon and swim through what happened on the 17th and 18th of February. 1944, 50-odd ships lie on the bottom, upright, broken, coral grown in water, so clear that on a good day you can see the shape of a hull from the surface. They go down into the Fujikawa Maru and find 0 fighters still in the hold, wings folded, propellers stacked beside them. They go down into the San Francisco Maru and find 3 tanks on the deck, in a row, turrets forward exactly as they were lashed. They swim through the galley of the Shinkoku Maru, which fueled the ships that struck Pearl Harbor, and the coral has covered her so completely that she looks less like a ship than a reef in the shape of a ship. And somewhere in the deepest part of the anchorage lie the pieces of the Ikoku Maru, and with them, in the same water, an American Avenger, and the 3 men who flew it, nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers. Lieutenant James Bridges, his radio man, his gunner, together since a Thursday morning in 1944. The men who crouched in the coral bunkers that morning said afterward that there had been 900 American aircraft in the sky. There were about 500, it does not matter, standing under it. No man alive could have counted, and the number they remembered was the number that was true to them, but those aircraft were not what killed Truk. They came, and in 2 days, they did what they had come to do. And they left, and they never came back in force. What killed Truk was the 18 months afterward. It was the silence. It was watching an entire fleet steam past your horizon in June of 1944 without so much as turning its guns toward you. It was digging gun pits for guns that would never fire, planting potatoes in a parade square, and understanding with absolute clarity that the war you had trained your whole life for had decided you were not worth the ammunition. That is what the Japanese learned at Truk. Not that America could destroy them, that America could afford to ignore them.